Realities in the secret life of Howard Hughes.
Acapulco, Mexico, 1976. On board a plane bound for Houston, Texas, is one of the legends of 20th century America, Howard Hughes. He will not survive the flight. Starved, emaciated, he weighs just 93 pounds. In the opinion of a doctor who examines the body, a penniless tramp could have expected better treatment in his last years. The full story of Hughes' descent into madness is still shrouded in mystery. Many of those who were close to him are bound by an oath of silence. But now 3 men, his chief advisor, his personal assistant, and his private investigator, have agreed to reveal what went on inside the secret life of Howard Hughes.
Power is a terrible, terrible thing. And I can speak firsthand because I inherited power by virtue of being his spokesman. And there is no doubt in my mind that power perhaps motivated Hughes more than anything else in the world.
You know, there are a lot of fallacies, you know, like guys with white gloves walking around and with plastic things over their shoes. That's all bull crap, you know. That never happened. It was just a tissue, but he did insist on tissues, and you'd make like paper towels where he would walk. He put paper towels on the floor. He could walk on that because he walked his bare feet most of the time.
And then he told the girls to always sleep with their bras on. They shouldn't sleep without a bra, you know, because the breast was very important with Howard Hughes. For the perfect beauty, you know.
In 1925, a tall, good-looking 20-year-old Texan set off from his home state, bound for the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. He had 2 assets and 1 handicap. The assets were a passion for the movies and a huge inherited fortune. The handicap was his young wife Ella, who was quickly made to realize that she had no place in her husband's new life. Hollywood's reaction was predictable. Here comes another sucker with money. But Howard Hughes was nobody's fool. Teaming up with the talented director Louis Milestone, Hughes produced a knockabout comedy called 2 Arabian Nights, which in 1928 won the coveted Oscar, only the 2nd to be awarded. Suddenly Howard Hughes was everywhere, and always with at least one glamorous girl on his arm. Hollywood in the 1920s responded to primeval instincts. Success was like the sun. Money and power were the wind and tide of the American dream. Hughes was Hollywood's most eligible bachelor, but there was something different about him.
He was terribly shy. As a matter of fact, that's what made him so endearing, I think, to women. You know, they just couldn't help themselves. He was such a little boy, that little boy. And he sort of stooped over, you know, and he would look so honest and so, you know, and he was, I'm sure. But he just had this streak in him, you know.
There was a streak in Howard Hughes, something unsettling. One by one, the most glamorous stars in Hollywood were caught up in his spell. Katharine Hepburn, Ginger Rogers, Bette Davis, Rita Hayworth. He had affairs with all of them, sometimes 2 at a time. Even more than sex or the search for a lasting relationship, conquest was his driving force. The hauntingly beautiful Billy Dove he literally bought, paying her husband $300,000 to grant her a divorce and leave the scene. But as soon as she belonged to Hughes, his interest waned. He was struggling to come to terms with his own sexuality.
Far from it being linked with love of women, I think there's a tremendous hatred and envy of women. He saw women as tremendously desirable and beautiful, and he wanted not only to possess that, but to enslave them, to destroy that, to destroy any feeling he might have had of their superiority over him.
He was trying to prove things to himself constantly, and of course he was fighting his homosexual side, and he was what is known as a Don Juan homosexual, a man who was bisexual or homosexual who feels if he beds as many women as possible, which is usually a narcissistic rather than heterosexual aspect, and controls them through that he is part of the great wide world and not just limited to his predilection.
Hughes was haunted by the dark complexities of his personal life. The voracious womanizer was also attracted to Hollywood's male stars. The first was Randolph Scott, who became his protégé. And since Scott was sharing an apartment with Cary Grant, this led to a second affair.
Of course, in that era, the 1920s and the 1930s, if a man had that bent, he was apt to be extremely paranoid. It wasn't the post-Stonewall liberated kind of gayness we know now. It was then something that drove many of them outright mental, made them mentally ill.
Hell's Angels, the opening of this picture at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, was the biggest premiere ever seen anywhere in the world before or since. 500,000 people are lining the streets.
Hughes' greatest and most costly Hollywood triumph, Hell's Angels, came from his passion for the wartime heroics of the early aviators. He bought 87 aircraft to make the flying sequences in the film as dramatic and authentic as possible. After sacking 2 directors, the 24-year-old Hughes took control of the picture himself. He also learned to fly in order to take part in the sensational dogfights. The film cost a record $4 million and the lives of 3 pilots. With no more conquests to be made on Earth, Howard Hughes set out to conquer the skies. In flying, he had found his true element, one that offered him success and solitude at the same time.
In aviation was Howard Hughes' greatest contribution to anything that he did. In the 30s, he flew airplanes at 400 miles an hour. His records flying from coast to coast certainly marked him as a major contributor to aviation, and he was a great pilot. There's no doubt of that whatsoever. He was a pilot who ranked with Charles Lindbergh.
In the 1930s, the ticker tape parade was America's own unique way of welcoming a conquering hero. But even as the adulation cascaded down after his round-the-world flight, inwardly Hughes was in torment. He hated outbursts of spontaneous emotion. Perhaps he even hated emotion itself when it was beyond his control. Above all, he hated crowds.
I always maintained that he was more or less of a recluse all his life. When he flew around the world in 1939, which was another major aviation accomplishment, when he landed at LaGuardia Airport in New York, they asked him how he felt, and he said, "Too many people here."
Hughes had created a legend around his flying exploits, but he always put off the attention of photographers and journalists until the very last moment.
And I want to say that to these newspapermen and photographers that I'm awfully sorry about the delay here, and if I've seemed to be in too much of a hurry to wait and pose for your pictures, it's not because I'm high-hat or anything like that, but just because I've been terribly worried that I wouldn't get out of here, and I hope you'll forgive me.
He wants to be the star, and everybody to look at him with admiration and envy, but then he's terrified of being looked at in an envious way. It's not such an uncommon thing. It's a very extreme and psychotic in him, but for example, the fear, stage fright. You want to be the star, and then you're on the stage, and you're terrified of being a star.
At the height of his fame, Howard Hughes could take no more. Leaving the crowds behind, he took off on a trek around America and secretly got himself a job as an ordinary airline pilot, personally loading the passengers' luggage before takeoff. It was several days before his true identity was discovered. The public image of Hughes was of a successful, self-made man. But in fact his great wealth came from his father, who had developed an ingenious drilling bit, the Rock Eater, which was a spectacular success, not just in the Texas oil fields, but around the world. The humble factory building in Houston, Texas was transformed into a gold mine. But that was his father's achievement, not Howard's. The son was determined to match that success.
I think what drove Hughes in life was the fact to succeed. You see, his father had been successful. He'd had some kind of success as a young man, but not to the extent he really wanted to. He was still tied into his father. And I think what it was, he wanted to succeed himself, which most kids do. Maybe his father didn't have the respect for him that he wanted. I kind of read that into things through the years. But he was a loner. He was definitely a loner. He wanted to do it his way, on his own.
Howard saw his chance in the booming field of aviation, which he knew well. He bought a small airline, which he kept entirely under his personal control. It became one of the international giants of the skies, Trans World Airlines, TWA. At the age of 27, he had founded Hughes Aircraft, where he planned to use his design skills on a new breed of racing plane. But Hughes' autocratic management made the company wasteful and inefficient. He desperately needed government contracts, and to get them he resorted to bribery. Most significant amongst those provided with lavish hospitality was the son of the late president, Elliott Roosevelt. Through corruption, Hughes secured 2 lucrative defense contracts, one for a new spy plane and another one to build this giant flying boat to transport troops to Europe. Nicknamed the Spruce Goose because of its wooden construction, it was the largest plane that has ever been built. $18 million of public money was poured into the project, but when the war ended, the plane still hadn't left the ground. Howard Hughes was summoned to Washington to face a Senate committee on charges of corruption.
Mr. Hughes, the papers say that you're going back to Washington. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm going there to testify before Senator Brewster's War Investigating Committee. As you know, the committee has caused quite a stir by its investigation of my 2 airplane projects, the XF-11 photographic plane and my large flying boat.
The money for the Spruce Goose came from the American taxpayer, but Hughes had treated the project as entirely his own, taking personal charge of the construction and meddling in every detail. He saw himself as performing his patriotic duty, but it resulted in the biggest national scandal of the entire war. Instigated by Senator Ron Brewster, who was already at loggerheads with Hughes, the hearings began on July the 28th, 1947.
It became a huge national scandal because it turned out that he had bribed the president's son and a lot of other people in order to win that contract, and then had never delivered the plane.
Being lost and buying the fares back. Now, what do you say about
The committee aimed to prove that Hughes Aircraft had supplied girls to Elliott Roosevelt in return for his influence in winning contracts. If Roosevelt, the press, and the public enjoyed it all hugely, Howard Hughes did not.
Mr. Meyer, specifically, were any of these girls that he got and made and paid money to, or that he gave presents to, was it for the purpose of getting in with me? And did any of those girls who were paid, were they procured for my entertainment?
And then finally, he did something astounding. Without any notice, in the middle of the hearings, he took that huge airplane made entirely out of plywood and flew it across the bay outside Los Angeles.
I put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Now he was back in the world of pilots and mechanics, which he knew and understood. He was 42 years old, and at last he felt in control again. For the first and the last time, the giant Spruce Goose lifted into the air, and for a while at least, the mental pressure that was bearing down on Hughes lifted with it. Woefully underpowered, the lumbering aircraft never took to the air again. Stubbornly, Hughes would spend $1 million a year on its preservation. When he died, the plane was still intact.
And he came back to Washington so much a hero that there was actually a Hughes for President boom. And yet, it was a victory that left him permanently scarred. For the rest of his life, he would remember that terrible violation of his privacy when he was dragged before that Senate committee.
Hughes escaped the censure of the committee by accusing Brewster of trying to blackmail him.
So, I ask you this question again, Senator Brewster. During my last trip to Washington, and while we were having lunch in your suite at the Mayflower Hotel, did you or did you not offer to call off this entire investigation if I would agree to merge TWA Trans World Airline with your friend Juan Tripp's Pan American Airways?
Hughes knew that Senator Brewster was trying to block the international expansion of his airline. In effect, Brewster was in the pocket of TWA's greatest rival, Pan Am. On the basis that one scandal cancels out another, Hughes was acquitted. But it was a hollow triumph. Hughes was profoundly and permanently damaged by the experience. He vowed to use his immense wealth in any way necessary, rather than be placed in the dock and once again forced to endure public scrutiny. He did not know it, but he was suffering from a rare condition known as scopophobia, a fear of being looked at.
He feels he wants to have everything and to be everything, and for everybody to be inferior and envious, and then he becomes terrified, not only of being seen, but of being in a crowd, of being in contact. Everybody is seen as a source of danger.
For one of the richest men in the world, there would be few pleasures and much inner torment in the years ahead. In the 1950s, a shadow fell across the bright lights of Hollywood, the shadow of McCarthyism. It blighted the careers of many actors, directors, and screenwriters accused of left-wing sympathies. But it suited the new mood of Howard Hughes. A decade had passed since the Senate hearings. Hughes at 50 was a changed man. The energy, the will, the desire for success were still there, but now they were enveloped in a cloak of suspicion and paranoia. One of those on his payroll was a private investigator named Jeff Shunard. He has never spoken publicly before.
I was an independent contractor with Howard Hughes, but I was doing whatever detective work he wanted done, you know, checking license plates. He was interested then mostly in anti-communist work, and that's what I was interested in also. We investigated different people at his studio who had communist sympathies, and he fired them. Whoever had communist sympathy was fired. They subsequently sued him and back and forth. And eventually it drifted into surveillances on his girlfriends, maybe 80% of the time with surveillances on beautiful women. He was always looking for the perfect woman. So Hughes would have these scouts around the country, and if they spotted someone that he might be interested in, he would send a photographer out wherever it be and send proof pictures of the girl. And if he decided he was interested, then he sent an agent offering her a screen test, bringing her to Hollywood. And then immediately we'd put a surveillance on her.
The need to own and control beautiful women had become a compulsion for Hughes, even though he rarely saw or slept with them. But there was always a condition. The girls must have no independent lives of their own. Jane Greer was one of those caught in Howard Hughes' net.
The men in the office, my mother and I met, they told us, and we do not want you to meet anyone else and go to dinner with anyone else or be in the company of anyone else. We want you to, Charlie Guest will come and take you to dinner once in a while, and but you can go to movies, you know, and to dinner, you know, by yourselves, but we don't want you, Mr. Hughes does not want you meeting anyone else or no dating or anything like that. We didn't have a life, you know, and this went on for months. I took lessons from the dramatic coach, and she was cute and nice and all that, but I never saw a still, I never saw a director, I never saw, you know, Howard Hughes.
Another actress manipulated by Hughes was Janet Leigh.
At one point, Mr. Hughes called me into his office, and he said, "This came to my attention, Janet," and he handed me this sheet of papers, and in it was every movement I had made for the past week, like left house at 9 o'clock a.m., 7:30, came out of house, got into a car driven by a brunette with a white flower in her hair, and I couldn't believe that he had done this.
Afraid of being looked at himself, Hughes was obsessed by the need to peer into the personal lives of his victims.
He used his extended eyes, as it were, his spies, to look at them in order to control them, to possess them, to have them in his power. Now, a person who feels like that about eyes, being such destructive element of control, possession, obviously will be afraid of being looked at.
Each girl had their own car and driver, and Hughes knew which streets to get to the studio and whatnot, and they were told, don't take Santa Monica Boulevard because there's railroad tracks there, and too much bouncing there. That's not good for their breasts, for their perfect breasts. So take Fountain Avenue, you know, that's smooth, no railroad tracks on that. And then they tell the girls to always sleep with their bras on. They shouldn't sleep without a bra, you know, because the breast was very important with Howard Hughes.
Jane Russell was the last Howard Hughes discovery to be launched into stardom. 2 good reasons for going to see this movie ran the publicity. Hughes' obsession with Jane's breasts was clear in the film. He even used his knowledge of aerodynamics to design a seamless, cantilevered bra to accentuate her assets. Unknown to Hughes, she found it too painful and never wore it.
2 years to make the Outlaw. 2 years to pack into 2 hours more excitement and thrill than has ever been in one picture before. And yet, it is unlike anything you have ever seen.
The film, which Hughes directed himself, turned into a bizarre personal fantasy. The censors made sure she kept her clothes on, but if ever an actress was reduced to a sex object, it was Jane Russell in The Outlaw. But in 1946, at the height of the film's success, catastrophe struck.
Howard Hughes, famous flyer and sportsman, was dragged out of this wreckage of an experimental plane he was testing. He was seriously injured. After ripping the corner from 2 homes in Beverly Hills, California, the plane finally plunged into this house. The force of the impact virtually wrecked the building and caused the plane to catch fire. The flyer said that the accident was due to motor failure shortly after his takeoff.
Critically injured and in great pain, Hughes nevertheless checked himself out of hospital before he had fully recovered. Having his basic bodily functions under the control of doctors and nurses was more than he could endure. But one thing from that hospital came to dominate the rest of his life. He'd been given the morphine-like drug codeine to ease the physical pain of his injuries, and he became utterly dependent on the drug. Increasingly, he came to see codeine as a way of easing the pain of being Howard Hughes. Even though he was hardly ever there, he ordered his headquarters in a run-down part of Los Angeles to be hermetically sealed, like a mausoleum. Contact with other human beings meant contact with germs and the noxious vapors of an environment he could hardly bear to be a part of. The world of Howard Hughes was under siege.
They had a fishing rod. They would lower that from the second floor, and I'd put my statement on that. They'd hook it up and bring it up, and they'd throw out my paycheck. Sometimes the wind would catch it, and I'd have to run down Romaine to catch my check. It was kind of ridiculous, you know.
Hughes was still lucid and as meticulous as ever, but obsessive fears were taking over his life.
He was a man who could dictate a 10-page memo on the proper opening of a can of fruit. Instructions in extraordinary detail on how to first wash the can, peel off the label, how many times it had to be washed, how many times the washers had to wash their hands before they could even pick up the can.
The man in charge turns the valve in the bathtub on, using his bare hands to do so. He adjusts the water temperature so that it is not too hot or too cold. He then takes one of the brushes and, using one of the bars of soap, creates a good lather, and then scrubs the can from a point 2 inches below the top of the can. He should first soak and...
Hughes was exhibiting the symptoms of a recognized psychiatric condition known as obsessive-compulsive disorder.
The typical thing is the sort of obsessional compulsive person who has to keep washing his hands, because he's so invaded with germs and bad things. He has to keep clean. Now in his case, he doesn't wash his hands, but everybody around him has to wash and goes through ceremonials to control those bad things called germs.
He'd been sick. Of course, after he had his crash, you know, and he got burned, and I'm sure that somewhere in his mind he didn't want to get any sicker. I always thought that anyway. I thought he just didn't want to get any sicker. He wanted to isolate us from any kind of pain that he might have to endure unnecessarily, and I think that's what that was all about.
In 1957, a new threat began to dominate his thoughts, that his closest associates would have him certified as insane and take over his financial empire. But if he were to marry, that would surely prove to the whole world that he was still perfectly normal. The actress Jean Peters had resisted his advances in the past. Now, at the age of 30, she succumbed. Hughes was 52. The marriage did nothing to improve his state of mind.
He came back from their wedding, a strange trip to Tonopah, Nevada, a ghost town, and immediately went into seclusion at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He took off all his clothes, he blacked out all the windows. He told his wife, his new wife, that he was in the hospital with an undiagnosed disease.
The couple lived in separate bungalows, and Jean, the last of the beautiful actresses drawn into his life, could not even enter his room. When they spoke at all, it was through a closed door. From now until his death, 19 years later, Hughes would rarely be seen in public again. But he was still at the hub of an extraordinary financial empire, headed by TWA, which had grown into one of the biggest airlines in the world. He still controlled his father's immensely successful tool company, and Hughes Aircraft was back making sophisticated weaponry for the government. He was employing 50,000 people and generating revenue of $1.4 million every day. His tax bill was potentially enormous.
Howard did not pay any personal income tax for 17 years in a row. The richest man in the United States paid no personal income tax at all. And yet he always felt cheated because his corporations had to pay taxes. So he came up with a plan. He established a charitable foundation and made a gift of his defense plant, the Hughes Aircraft Company, to that charitable foundation, so that all of the profits of his munitions factory went into a charitable foundation for the benefit of all mankind. However, not one penny was spent on charity. All of it went out the back door to Howard himself. It was a tax dodge that was so brazen that no one has even begun to parallel it in history.
Hounded by the taxman, Hughes decided to move his operations to the low-tax state of Nevada. One way or another, he reckoned he would soon have every local politician on his payroll and be back in control once more. In Las Vegas, he took over the entire 9th floor of the Desert Inn Hotel and sealed it off from the outside world. Jean Peters did not accompany him. Instead, she sued for divorce. One man who was allowed into Hughes' strange new world was Gordon Margulis, once a boxer in England and then Hughes' personal aide.
Where we are here, this was the area that Hughes lived in when he was here. Of course, the whole 9th floor was his. He took over the whole 9th floor. And some of the aides lived on the lower floor and the 8th floor below. The only way, of course, up here was on the elevator, which had a special key. You could look out, beautiful scenery as you see, but of course he never looked out.
Many people thought he was dead, and some people thought his body had been frozen long ago and he would be revived in the year 2020 or 2520 or something when the medical science would save him. Such things as that. Or he had been, he was dead and his body was frozen, and that was to avoid tax.
Hughes was very much alive, but petrified of contamination by germs, which he saw in any form of human contact.
If you handed him anything, say you're handing him a spoon, okay? All right. Number one, the box, you'd have to have a Kleenex underneath the box. Okay. All right. Now, take out a tissue, put the box down, and make sure it's on the tissue, right? Okay. Place a spoon in there. Wrap this one over there. Hold it with your thumb. Wrap that one over there. Take it like this. Wrap it around. Make sure it's tight. And when you handed it to him, take out another Kleenex and hand it to him. Like that. That's the way you would do it. And that's the way you would hand him anything. You always had a Kleenex in your hand when you handed it to him. And you always, a good idea was always to have one in the other hand just in case. You see, here's the thing about the phobia with germs, too. That room was not kept clean. Nobody was allowed to clean anything there, to vacuum in there or do anything. So there's kind of a, how do you keep a thing, you know, here we are with tissues to keep things clean, and yet here we are with a floor that's not vacuumed, or drapes that are not vacuumed, you know, drapes get like, or anything, especially out in the desert with all the dust and the sand. It's kind of a contradiction, really. You know, he used to keep his urine in Knorr jars in a closet in his bedroom, and when I first heard about that, I thought, boy, that's strange. And I thought maybe some medical reason, maybe that they sent him away to analyze for some reason. I didn't know.
Analyzing a dead man is really, in a way, futile exercise. But it seems to me that this is so much part of this narcissistic picture of the tremendous overvaluation of his product. You see, other people's urine is filth, but his urine is gold. It's better than father's semen, which is sticky and dirty. It's better than mother's milk. It's a real gold dust.
I always thought, you know, his mother was the big influence in his life, because that's really all he had when he was young, with his mother. And she was very good to him, obviously, and she did everything for him. She did everything for him. I always figured that maybe in his heart he was looking for his mother to come back and clean up.
Downstairs at the Desert Inn, the punters played the tables, hoping to win a fortune. Upstairs was a man who had already acquired one beyond their wildest dreams, living in a single room with the blinds drawn, entirely naked for much of the time, his body unwashed, his hair, his beard, and his nails uncut. But Hughes urgently needed someone to represent him in the world outside, and he chose former FBI agent Robert Maheu.
I was flabbergasted when he told me that he had chosen me to be his alter ego. And he pointed out to me that he would cooperate, and that from that day on we would embark on a campaign where we would convince the world that when I spoke, Howard Hughes was talking.
That was a very curious decision, and said something about who he had become. Hughes was no longer looking for a businessman to run his empire. He was looking for a tough guy to protect him from a world that he had come to see as a dangerous conspiracy against him.
This would be perhaps the most intimate relationship in Howard Hughes' life, and the most bizarre. The two men worked closely together for 13 years, and yet they never met. They kept in contact by telephone or through messages scribbled on yellow legal pads. Thousands of these secret memos were stolen from Hughes' offices just before he died. Investigative reporter Michael Drosnin tracked them down.
Their memos sound like a couple who have been married too long, bickering. There's no other way to describe it. Both of them got into it finally, listing their grievances, talking about having spent sleepless nights, recapitulating their fights, placing blame, and then making up, promising to turn over a new leaf and start again.
Bob, I regret last night as much as I assume you do. Perhaps I regret it more.
Howard, first of all, I hope you understand that you do not have an exclusive on sleepless nights.
Well, Bob, I will be very happy to believe you about everything. I think a good starting point would be for you to affirm your original promise to stay with me permanently.
I really tried to communicate with him and convince him of the necessity of my seeing him. And after about 4 hours of conversation, he told me what I believed at the time to be the truth. He told me that if I saw his physical appearance, the manner in which he had neglected himself and his environment, that I could never again represent him with the same amount of enthusiasm and success as I had in the past.
The Desert Inn, Las Vegas, 1968. Living in squalor, with his mind wandering, and hopelessly addicted to drugs, Howard Hughes still managed to make his presence felt in corporate boardrooms and political backrooms across the nation. To the outside world, there was nothing illusory about his power and influence. When Howard Hughes spoke, even Washington paid attention. At the end of the 1960s, the United States embarked on a series of nuclear tests under the Nevada desert, 150 miles from Las Vegas. Hughes was horrified. This was his own backyard.
He would be on the phone to me and he'd say, Bob, make sure that you're safe where you are, and I'm as safe as can be here, and I'm so afraid that this building will start rocking. And the night before he'd say, do you think it's worth calling the White House again? Do you think it's worth doing this? And just the few moments before, I mean, he would just get all shook up, really badly.
His penthouse would actually shake just a bit. And nothing else reached him, and that did.
He gave me the assignment of going to Florida and with $1 million in cash to convince President Nixon that he was prepared to put up this amount of money to stop underground testing.
Nixon had accepted money from Hughes before he became president, but this was different. Not even Howard Hughes, with all his wealth, could alter the nuclear policy of the United States. But inside his fantasy world, he still believed he could shape America's political destiny.
There is no more chilling example than what happened on the night that Bobby Kennedy died.
Is there a doctor in the house, please? It's very important. We need a doctor.
quiet.
And Howard, watching on television, saw the assassination and immediately wrote a memo to his right-hand man, Bob Maheu. I mean, the opening is chilling. I hate to be quick on the draw, but I see here an opportunity that may not happen again in a lifetime. And he went on to say, I want you to hire the entire Kennedy organization so that we can put my own man in the White House.
Maheu made secret approaches and put Larry O'Brien, Kennedy's campaign manager, on the Howard Hughes payroll at $15,000 a month. The outcome was ironic in the extreme. When Republican President Richard Nixon sent in his men to burgle O'Brien's office in the Watergate Hotel, their object was to uncover any connection between the Democratic Party and Howard Hughes. The investigation that followed led to Nixon's resignation in August 1974. In trying to buy a government, Hughes had succeeded in toppling a president.
Imagine sitting naked, unwashed, with your hair down to your ass and your fingernails 6 inches long and your toenails longer, in a room covered with filth and debris, and yet managing from that total seclusion, living like the worst lunatic in history, managing nonetheless to control presidents of the United States, to work your will on major corporations, to buy an entire state and run it practically single-handed. No one's ever done anything like that, at least not since Nero, and not since the craziest of the Roman emperors, the maddest of the Russian czars. There's never been anything like him in modern times.
Meanwhile, another equally bitter power struggle was developing in the Desert Inn Hotel. As Howard Hughes deteriorated mentally and physically, his executives and minders had gradually become more like his jailers. Now they were fighting amongst themselves for control of his empire. Most of them were Mormons, originally chosen by Hughes for their loyalty.
The aides were in the environs of Hughes 24 hours a day on different shifts. And most of the communications were related through the aides. There were very, very few people who had direct access to Hughes, either by handwritten memo or telephonically.
They would say, well, you know, he can't have any medication until he's signed this paper. Now they would say that, you know, the aides or whoever, they would say that, yeah. And I remember Mel Stewart told me on many occasions, you know, that he was in there, and Mel Stewart was his nurse. I said to him one day, boy, it's like a control. He said, that's the way they control him, Gord. That's the way they do it, you know.
I think they realized that the more they could control his contact with the outside world, the more powerful they were.
In 1970, Hughes made a fateful decision. He fired Robert Maheu, perhaps the one man who might have kept his crumbling world intact, and gave his minders complete control over his empire. To escape Maheu and his lawsuits, they spirited him out of the Desert Inn and flew him to the Bahamas. But when Life magazine announced it was serializing his memoirs, Hughes called a long-distance press conference to denounce the hoax. For the first time in 15 years, America heard the voice of Howard Hughes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hughes.
Good afternoon to you, Mr. Neal. Oh, I hear you well now.
Where are you speaking from right now, sir?
I suppose you call it, Nassau. This is Paradise, Iowa.
There have been a lot of stories about your health. How is your health?
Well, how the hell is anybody's health at 66 years of age?
One final question, Howard. Are you happy? Or, you know, as happy as someone with $2.5 billion can be?
I'm not, not very happy, I'll tell you that. And one of the primary reasons is because of some of the things we've been discussing here tonight. That is to say, in other words, the impediments upon my freedom and activities imposed by all of this litigation and these overhanging threats of various types, this threatened autobiography and so forth. All these matters are very draining in their effect upon me, and so if you, well, you're your question was, am I happy and content? The answer is no.
Isolated from the outside world by his minders, who provided him with drugs, Kleenex, and movies, Hughes had become a virtual prisoner. Pathetically vulnerable, the naked emperor flew with his palace guard from one country to another, desperate for more drugs. The more confused he became, the more he fell under his minders' control. One brief port of call was the Bayshore Inn in Vancouver.
He looked out the window and he said to me, "Look at that." And I said, "Yeah, it's a beautiful view, isn't it?" He said, "Yes, it is." And it is, because you're looking out at the mountains. You know, it's a beautiful view. He said, "I think I'll make this my bedroom." I said, "I would if I were you." I said, "You know, you can sit here and look out and do as you please." And the aides are going, "Shh, shh, shh. No, 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 no. This is his room over there." So they shove him back in a bedroom, you know, with the curtains drawn, everything blacked out again. There he goes again, you know. And that was a chance, I thought, at the Bayshore Inn for him to really look out at the world again. But it never happened.
By now his physical condition was appalling. Emaciated and fragile, he had terrible bed sores and was so constipated that he sometimes remained in the lavatory for 24 hours at a time. But his minders decided to move him yet again, this time to Mexico.
There were 4 doctors that worked for Hughes and several that were called in from time to time. There were executives in California and Las Vegas that were constantly informed of his condition. And his condition was terrible. He weighed 95 pounds. He was 6'4", and he weighed 95 pounds, a long scraggly beard, etc., etc.
When Hughes' condition deteriorated still further, his doctors decided to take him back to America for intensive medical care.
The day before they put him on a flight to take him to Houston, I went in there in the afternoon into his room, and he called me. I went in there, and he said he was trying to put this needle in his arm to take a shot, and he wanted me to help him, you know. And I said, no, I don't know if you can do that crap. He lapsed into a coma that day, and I'd been up some hours, and I remember going, I went in and laid down, and they called me back in, and we trimmed, Mel Stewart and I trimmed his beard, and trimmed his nails. Nails were very, very long. Cut his nails, we trimmed his beard, trimmed his hair, and it's an ironic thing, really, because now you got people around him saying, that didn't seem to care too much before. Now they're saying, well, you know, you can't have people see him like this. You know, that's...
April the 5th, 1976. Howard Hughes is taking his last flight. He will die in the air before the plane touches down in Houston. His codeine addiction, along with severe dehydration and malnutrition, had finally pushed him over the edge. According to the autopsy, he died of kidney failure, but many people feel that Hughes died from a disease called neglect.
The whole severance had caused me such remorse, and my first reaction was, I hope the son of a bitch suffers. I truly felt that way. And I start reading about the autopsy, the condition in which they found him, with broken hypodermic needles in his arms. And my wife ran up to me and she said, "Honey, what's wrong? You're crying." Yes, I was crying.
All his life, Howard Hughes craved recognition from the world, even whilst he hid away from it. He wanted to be a legend, revered for his pioneering feats of aviation, for his aircraft designs, his business vision, and his movies. Instead, he will probably be remembered for quite different things. His bizarre exploitation of women, his strange paranoid personality, the abuse of his enormous power, his years as a recluse, and above all, for the way he corrupted the American dream.
In the end, you had to feel sorry for him. And it's almost, how you felt about King Kong at the end of the movie. You know, he had just trampled hundreds of people and knocked over half of New York. But when he gets shot at the top of the Empire State Building, you bleed with him. You care about him. I think because he was innocent of his own evil. And the same thing about Howard. I don't think he was ever aware of what he was doing. He was only trying to protect himself.
Next week's Secret Life series concludes with a look at the man behind the legend of Che Guevara. That's next Thursday night at 9.
Where does it come from? Where does the energy and power come from? Who recharges your battery? You know what I'm talking about.